So, this video, I would like to talk about homelessness in North America because I feel the way we treat homeless people is really despicable. And the problem I see is the huge problem that people often, pretty much always, seem to blame homeless people for their own predicament. All sorts of stuff that can happen that's outside of their control, like the cost of housing, like having their house burned down, or having an illness or losing their employment, can suddenly make someone end up homeless. But yet we treat homeless people like absolute shit in this country, in my country, Canada, and in the United States, it seems just as bad, if not. I'm not sure if it's worse, but I think it's probably worse in Canada even. Well, they have more people in the United States, so they're going to have more homeless people in general. But the problem I see is the huge lack of empathy for anyone who is homeless, who happens to be in that situation. And what we do with them is just absolutely, it makes no sense. Like one of the things I've seen here in Canada, and I've seen in the United States, there's that town on Grants Pass where they've recently put in laws where they can, criminalize homeless people, basically. And it seems ridiculous to me that someone could be homeless and the solution we have is to write them a ticket. They're already homeless. They're probably maybe getting a welfare check, which isn't enough to even rent a place. How are they supposed to pay a ticket? What is that going to do? It's just going to cut off them from even having food. But that's what we do. The other thing we do is, these street sweeps where police just come in and just rip the people's tents up if they're living in a tent, throw out all their possessions, which I'm sure is hard enough to hold on to just being homeless. And that's the solution we have. And then they just have to move somewhere else. So I don't see how that's a solution either. And I'm going to play a few clips here to other people who have the similar kinds of opinions.
Here in California, in particular, we could pay for it many times over. Because you know what we do? The way California deals with homelessness, and this is the other reason I wanted to highlight Redondo Beach here. You see what happens when they just give a little bit as far as housing goes. They just have a few programs that get people into mostly interim housing. This is not, well, Redondo Beach is not a housing first thing, but it's closer than what a lot of other cities and neighborhoods in the area do. Now, not just for anyone who's not, Redondo Beach is its own city, but it's part of LA County. So, what we typically do in the Los Angeles area, and other places do this too, it's not solely unique to Los Angeles, is we have these things called sweeps. And what sweeps are is cops go in and they just displace homeless people. They just force them out of an area and they just gotta basically go somewhere else. It's as if they're shooing rodents or something. It's disgusting. It's morally repulsive. It should not be legal to do in a civilized society. And that's what the city of Los Angeles does on a regular basis. And how much do these sweeps cost? They cost millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars throughout the course of the year. All that money could go to a housing first program.
So just like what he said, they're spending millions of dollars potentially on just moving homeless people around, just telling them, get out of this area, get out of this park or whatever. And it doesn't even accomplish anything at all. In fact, it probably just makes the problem worse because they just go somewhere else. Now they've lost all their possessions, so they're probably even more out in the open for people, and it makes things probably more dangerous because instead of being in one area, now you've moved them to someplace else. They might be in front of a store shooting up dope or something like that. You don't know, but it doesn't actually solve any kind of problem at all. And the other thing is, I see, people often say, well, why don't they just go to a shelter or something like that? Well, the shelters are more dangerous than the actual, than being homeless or something like that. I've got this other clip here. It's of a woman who became homeless, and she happens to be dealing with it by, just uh, being in living in a an airport. And if you listen to what she has to say here, she says that it's because it's definitely safer than on the street or in a shelter.
They look like tired travelers waiting for a flight. But take a closer look. These people are actually homeless.
Well, since right now I'm completely broke, so not going anywhere, just going hiding different parts of the airport.
Rebecca has lived here with her adult son and cat for almost a year. She says the airport is safer than the streets and overcrowded shelters.
I left Phoenix for $15,000. Real quick.
The job and apartment she had lined up both fell through. Then she lost $3,500 in a rental scam. Broke, she landed at the airport, homeless. She uses the Wi-Fi at the airport to apply for jobs. She did get a job, ironically, here at the airport, doing what she did in Phoenix, pushing passengers in wheelchairs, but was fired a week later. She believes the company found out she was homeless. Since January, she has been living at a long-term hotel where she can now cook, shower, and finally sleep in a bed.
So look at that, She, had actually planned, did everything potentially. It seems like she tried to do everything right. Like having money before she came, she had a place lined up, had a job lined up, and all of that fell through and she ended up being homeless. And people will say, well, why don't you go to a shelter or something like that? But the shelters are dangerous because they're filled that you're shoulder to shoulder with people, especially being a woman in a shelter. That's insanely dangerous. You don't know if you're going to get robbed or not. You could get robbed on the street too. So what she decided to do was actually somewhat quite smart, really, of deciding to go and live in the airport. Because at least in the airport, most people would just assume you're just a passenger waiting for a plane. They don't know you're actually homeless, and at least you're in a more kind of public area where there's security guards and such, and you won't get bothered as much as you would if you were sleeping on the street or if you were in a shelter, where you probably wake up in the shelter one morning and find out you've been robbed. So you're even in a worse situation. So you go to the shelter to try to get yourself out of homelessness and end up in a worse financial situation after you've gone into the shelter. So it just isn't a solution. But unfortunately, that's how we treat people. And even in the video, she mentioned that she got a job and that she was supposed to have a job at the airport. And she said they fired her when they found out that she was homeless, that she didn't have an actual address. Because that's another thing people seem to forget about is that, if you don't have an address, you can't get a job. Because a job is going to a job interview, they're going to want a background check. They're going to know where you're living, what your address is, what your phone number is. And if you can't provide them with that basis, no one's going to be like, okay, well, come in tomorrow and we'll find something for you to do. Maybe that how it used to be, like maybe in like the 50s or something like that. Good luck finding a job now if you don't have a cell phone, internet access, and an apartment address, at least. Because if you don't have those basic things, no one's going to help you out. And then you're going to end up homeless, and people are going to tell you, well, it's your fault. Well, how is it your fault when you're trying to find a job? You're trying to find a place for yourself, and no matter how hard you try, you can't even do it. That's the problem I see with how we treat homeless people here. And nonetheless, doing street sweeps that cost money for police to come and just harass homeless people basically, and then move them from one area to another and write them a ticket or something like that on top of it. It makes no sense at all. But that's what governments in North America seem to be doing.
So let's look at some of the specifics here. This is devastating. The US homeless population increased by more than 18% in a year, driven by high housing costs. Oh, wow. Look at the honesty here. Usually you get the deflections and the obfuscations like from conservatives where they say, oh, it's all about mental illness. It's all about paranoid schizophrenia. It's all about drug addiction. It's all about your individual moral failings. That's what they try to do. They try to gaslight you into thinking it's only individual moral failings and that's why people end up homeless. That is not true. There are massive economic and systemic factors that lead to this. The number one is high housing costs. So driven up 18% a year, driven by high housing costs, natural disasters, and a spike in migration to large cities, government officials said. The Department of Housing and Urban Development said Friday that more than 770,000 people were in shelters. 770,000. The old number that I always came across was like 600,000. Temporary housing or had no shelter, according to a survey carried out one night, January 2024. That number follows a 12% increase the previous year and is the highest since the federal government began an annual count of the homeless population in 2007. So highest ever. Highest ever. Last year there was a 12% increase. This year there's an 18% increase. Record number of homeless. The figure is likely an undercount as it does not include people temporarily staying with family and friends. That's an important point right there because this number is clearly an undercount. Because there are plenty of people who are homeless, but they're still able to sort of mask it a little bit. because they have a friend or they have a family member who will take them in, and you can sleep on the couch or you can sleep in the basement, right? That's a thing. That's a thing. And those people are, there's like levels to homelessness. There's levels to it. And that's probably the first level, right? We got evicted, can't pay the bills, but we have loved ones who will allow us in and let us stay there for a certain period of time, right? There's that. And then, like I said, there's a whole ladder. There's different levels to this shit. One of those levels is living in your car, right? If you don't have a family member or friend who will let you stay in the basement or on the couch or whatever, you live in your car. Um, and then, of course, there's a lot of the very obvious homelessness. That's usually like the final step where it's like there's just nowhere for these people to go. Nowhere. All right, let's continue here.
Just as he said, the homelessness in the United States and in Canada too is skyrocketing, and it's not necessarily the person's fault that they became homeless, but that's how we're stigmatizing people consistently. We're consistently stigmatizing anyone who's homeless as if it's their fault. It's only about drugs. They made poor life choices. What if none of that is true? Because like I know people who with the forest fires in Canada who've lost their homes and ended up homeless. And it has nothing to do with that's wildfire. It's completely out of their control whatsoever. But they end up on the street and people don't know who they are. They just happen to be on the street, and people will end up treating them like crap just because they're out in that situation, even though it's no fault of their own, even though they were employed before the fire took their home and everything they owned, and then they end up in that situation, and we're just like, oh well, that's your fault. How is it your fault? Is it your fault that a lightning bolt hit you? That it's your fault that someone drove over you and now you're paralyzed and that's suddenly your fault because that's how we're looking at it with homelessness. Even people who, we have people who are homeless who are working multiple jobs, some working two jobs and still like living in their car or something, right?